Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. And today we are going to talk about 3 misconceptions that people have about the sign of Cancer. So, if you've been following along with this series, you know that I've been going through each of the zodiacal signs in order and talking about 3 popular misconceptions that people have about each sign, and then hopefully helping people get a deeper understanding of the sign in the process. So, today we're going to talk about Cancer. This is the sign of the crab, and it's a water sign. It's a feminine water sign. And we also associate this sign with the moon. This is the temple of the moon, and also the exaltation of Jupiter. This is also the place where the planet Mars is depressed. And we also call this sign a tropical sign, which means, comes from the word tropos, which means to turn. And sometimes you'll hear the sign similarly called a cardinal sign. So we're going to break down the sign a little bit today and hope to liberate it from some of its most unfortunate misconceptions. Now, I've said this for every sign that we've done so far. These are misconceptions slash stereotypes. And it's not that I want to validate some of these and where they come from, but hopefully also just go a lot deeper. So the 3 we're going to talk about with Cancer today. Number 1, Cancer is all about home and family. Not true. Some truth to it, but generally speaking, why is this just mostly a kind of unfortunate misconception? Number 2, Cancers are needy. Again, not true. There is some truth to that. At times, this can be true, but why? And why is there a lot more to the sign of Cancer than this kind of stereotype? And then finally, Cancer is passive aggressive. This is also not true, but can be true. I have a sun in Cancer, Mercury in Cancer, and so certainly there are times where I've noticed that I can be passive aggressive. But where do these things come from, and what's the deeper essence of the sign, and why? And also, why do we tend to get caught up on some of these more superficial elements of the signs in general? One of the main reasons we do is because most of modern astrology in general, I'm just talking about pop modern astrology, doesn't educate us about the nature of the signs, the nature of the planets, and why they belong to each sign. For example, why is Cancer the temple of the moon and the temple of Jupiter's exaltation? Why does Mars not do so well in this sign? And so on and so forth. So we break those things down a little bit more and also look at the sort of the zodiac as an ideal mathematical circle that is mapping out an alternation between light and dark. When we get to Cancer, what stage of the exchange between light and dark, or yang and yin, if you want to use that terminology even, what stage does Cancer come at? And therefore, what is the kind of the deeper mythology and archetypal nature of the sign? And then once you have that, you start realizing, okay, these are just very superficial kind of emanations, little like bubbles coming off from the top of a really deep wellspring. And then that's the truth for every single sign, which is why I decided to do this series, because I read comments that people leave in the chat boxes on Instagram and YouTube and things like that, and a lot of the times what I see are people getting part of it right, but often lingering stereotypes will surround the signs. So the other thing to say about this is that in ancient astrology, the signs were not primarily used or understood in terms of psychological character traits. So the other thing that's important to realize in doing this series is that we're trying to understand what a sign is about on an archetypal level. A sign is a temple of a god, or the temple of 2 gods in the cases of signs that have both a domicile and an exaltation ruler. And understanding that is really important, because in ancient astrology, signs are really facilitating the relationships between planets. And they're also connecting the planets to different topics by virtue of becoming the 12 whole sign houses. And so in a sense, signs are like lightning rods connecting the gods to Earth. And so once you understand that, and then you understand something about the nature of the sign, and then why the planets get matched up with the sign, then you really, I always say this, you have an understanding that goes much deeper than keywords that you end up memorizing, which are often what they exist right alongside of stereotypes and misconceptions. So All of that being said, let's talk about Cancer and why Cancer is more than home and family, neediness, wet, Cancer, the wet blanket, Cancer, the needy wet blanket, all about home and family and passive aggressive. These are the things that I see all the time, that I honestly have, heard a lot being a Cancer sun myself too. So, all right, I'm going to share my astronomy program with you guys right now and just show you a few things that are it's kind of cool. So here's a picture of the sun. I hid the daylight, so you're looking at the sun in an artificially darkened sky, just so that I can show you what it looks like. This is the sun on the summer solstice, which is the beginning of the sign of Cancer. This means that the sun has reached its highest space of latitude relative to the celestial equator. And that's the Tropic of Cancer, we sometimes call that, right? So the arc of the sun, which is this green line called the ecliptic, the arc of the sun has reached its highest point, which means you're going to get the longest day. It takes the sun the longest to go across the sky because it rises up so high and goes down. You're going to get the longest day of the year. Now, this is from the Northern Hemisphere's perspective, but remember that this is not to be taken literally. It is to be understood as a kind of ideal symbolic system. It's a divinatory system. So at any rate, once you look at this, here's another thing to look at to make sense of it. We're just going to kind of turn our perspective so that we can look up at the sky. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert the North Celestial Pole, which is back here. So you can kind of see this pole star. Now, the ancients imagined that as the sun was rising in the sky day by day toward the summer solstice, that the sun was also moving toward that pole star, which is an unchanging center. Nothing, everything in the sky is like all the other stars that the astrologers are tracking, they're moving. Primary motion is moving things along. The stars very gradually are drifting. The planets are wandering. Planets mean wanderers. But then you have this pole star that doesn't move. It's fixed. And so this was imagined as symbolically as something like eternity. The pole star has the value of God or eternity symbolically because it doesn't change. So the sun is rising up toward the pole star. It reaches the closest it will get to the pole star. And as it reaches that sort of closest the high point, from that moment forward, it's going to drop back down. And as it's going down, the arc in the sky is going to come down all the way down to the Tropic of Capricorn, where we'll have our shortest day of the year. And the same arc in the sky, you can imagine, is going to be much lower. And so that's going to give us our shortest day of the year. And as this is happening, the sun is also descending down toward the earth from our perspective, toward the southern horizon. So you're talking about the sun moving upward towards something that's being imagined as celestial, otherworldly, transcendental, divine. And then from Cancer forward, the sun starts to go down toward the earthly plane. Some ancient philosophical schools would have looked at the earth as more or less a kind of prison house. Like, for example, this world is something that we're bound up in by ignorance. To a certain extent, you can see this in Plato's allegory of the cave. We're not meant to be prisoners shackled to dense matter, that we have higher knowledge or higher truth or even higher forms of reality that exist that we can aspire to somehow through a philosophical life, through mystical practices and so forth. You see this in the East, and it's all over the place. but sometimes you'll see different ways of regarding the earth in relation to the below in relation to the above, and some are a little bit more condemning than others. Regardless, the sign of Cancer is the gateway of mankind. That's one of the names that it's given in the ancient world, because it's related with, the return of life, or the descent of spirit into matter. So here comes the sun descending from above down into the earthly sphere. So in that sense, it was related to the moon. Why would this be? Because our earthly sphere, the material sphere, in comparison or by comparison to the celestial spheres, or to the heavenly sphere, or to the divine, to the spiritual realm, was considered a relatively denser place. So the moon was the planet that was considered to be closest to Earth, and was symbolic of the earthly plane in general. The moon was the ruler of the sublunary sphere, which is sort of like this, the moon is the planet that's most intimately connected with our material existence. The material existence is defined by one kind of feature in particular, which is the constancy of change, which is a kind of funny way of putting it. But just like the moon is always changing faces, is growing light and bright and full, and then is losing light, shedding or sloughing off the light, and then growing dark again. This material world is defined by forms that are temporary, that come into being and then pass away. So the coming into being and the passing out of being, generation and decay and death, that is the constant here. Now, you have to remember that the ancients are perceiving, in many cases, the soul as entering this world, but the soul is immortal, or the soul is unborn and undying. And so a soul entering the realm of coming to be and passing away would mean that it's passing through the moon. And oftentimes the reverse is true. When someone's supposedly reaching enlightenment, they also have to pass through the moon going back up. Interesting. Not surprisingly, the opposite sign of Capricorn was called the gateway of the gods, and it happens to occur as the light is returning again, and we're moving upward toward the summer solstice again, and that was associated with the departing of the soul from the body, and the transmigration of the soul back toward the realm of the gods. It's a Saturn ruled sign, so a sign that is associated with death and also crossing beyond the threshold. Saturn was a planet that sat as the dimmest, most distant planet, and the planet that was a guardian of the threshold between the realm of the planets and the divine beyond. And so the Cancer Capricorn gateway has a lot to do with transmigration of the soul into matter, into the sublunary sphere of the earth, and then out again and beyond. There's a lot of mystery in Capricorn that people don't understand. We'll be talking a lot about that when we eventually get to the misconceptions of Capricorn. Now, so the moon, Cancer, is associated with the moon because we're talking about the sign that starts to ferry the spirit soul down into the sublunary sphere, into a body that will come into being and pass out of being, into the world of generation and decay and so forth. So the moon and Cancer are associated with that. Now, the other thing you have to remember is that ancients were very aware of the fact that the moon was not an original, but a reflective light. And that's really important too, because if you think about the general view that we see in Plato about the sublunary sphere, that, so to speak, that we belong to, he said it's a place of shadows, a place of replicas, meaning we are seeing in the coming to be and passing away of forms like a shadow dance of higher forms that exist in a spiritual world that doesn't experience the coming to be and passing away of matter. And that is, loosely speaking, the realm toward which, or the dimension of consciousness toward which, or from which the soul comes, and toward which the soul is eventually going to return, or needs to aim itself toward, if it doesn't want to get perpetually caught up in the cycle of reincarnation, or sort of recycling as the moon does ever and ever, but caught up in a place of shadows. Okay, so these are all metaphors, you could say, too. And the moon, as not an original but a reflective light, is therefore emblematic of the appearances in this world that reflect higher truth, but are themselves always temporary. You can't hold them. It's like sand falling through your fingers. This is really important because all of these are metaphors and images, and the time of year where the light starts to descend downward toward the earth again, and the gateway of mankind, and the moon and the sublunary sphere and the reflective light. See, all of this is getting at the essence of what Cancer is all about. This sign also exalts Jupiter, and that's a place that has a lot of meaning too. I won't go so much into that today, but one of the things that's needed when life proliferates is some kind of cohesiveness or order: family, tribe, nation, law, religion, custom, culture, the things that hold us together and create some kind of order within our material experience that is reflective of a higher cosmic sense of unity. And that's also a part of why we could say that Jupiter is exalted in this sign. Now, Mars is in its fall, and that's a really complex thing as well. I've talked about that in a number of videos in the past, but Mars is a planet that separates and severs and cuts. And one of the things that we can experience in this sign of Cancer, in the sublunary sphere, that's especially acute and difficult, is separation. We feel separated from the source that we've descended down from. We feel separated from the womb that we've come out of. We feel apart from the connection. We feel think about the prisoner. What does the prisoner have to do in the allegory of the cave? He has to cut or free himself from his bondage, and then he has to cut ties even with the people in the cave who might kill him if he tries to say that there's something higher or beyond the shadows that they're watching, and that they're chained and shackled and bound to watch. So cutting cords, umbilical cords being cut, severing connection to source, standing apart from the source of our divine or original source. These are complicated topics in the sign of Cancer. So Mars is depressed or in its fall in this sign. And that's just a brief example, it's kind of a brief treatment. But so all of these things are important. Why? Because now we have to understand why it's these images, these myths and metaphors that are behind some of the misconceptions. So for example, Cancer is all about home and family. Is there some truth to the home and family? Yes, but why? And why is it also much deeper and more complicated or sophisticated than just home or family? I mean, I can't tell you how many Cancer sun, Cancer moon, Cancer rising people I've met who live alone, for example, or who have wandered away from family, or who don't have a family, or who are not completely focused on home or family, right? So why would that be the case? Because it's a lot more complicated than that. When you think about light descending from the pole star and the descent of spirit into matter, this is where a number of spiritual traditions address our place in the sublunary sphere through from one particular, almost like a religious psychology. And I would call it the psychology of devotion. This is part and parcel of bhakti yoga. I'm a Cancer, not surprisingly. I would gravitate towards something like bhakti. From a religious psychology standpoint, it makes a lot of sense for me. Why do we circumambulate gods and shrines? Why do we pray the rosary on beads in circles? Why, in my own bhakti tradition, do we repeat the names of God over and over on beads that are 108 deep, 108 being the sacred number of the moon in the ancient world, a number associated with the moon for some really interesting esoteric reasons. Why circumambulate? Because in this world, circumambulation is inevitable. Just like the moon is always circumambulating, we too will circumambulate, but we will circumambulate things, that are either going to point us home toward our source, our divine source, which we are temporarily apart from, or that we may easily forget in this realm of shadows, so to speak. Or we can remember things that will point us back home. So we're always remembering one of two things. And you can tell this all the time. When a kid is little, it needs, a child needs its mother or the breast or a blanket or a bottle or, whatever. It needs in preschool, call them loveys. You need a little lovey to keep with you at school in case, you feel separation anxiety. So the whole world is like that, actually. All of the things that we do tend to be about separation anxiety on a metaphysical level. So so we're all creatures of habit who establish ways of circumambulating around different shrines. And the shrines in our lives are all meant to give us a feeling of connection from something that we feel separate or apart from. And so as long as we're doing that repetitively in circles, round and round, but the thing that we are circumambulating isn't helping us to remember our spiritual nature, is the extent to which we will be caught up in the round of reincarnation. That's the idea. On the other hand, to the extent that we remember things that point us home toward our true nature, love, divinity, and all of the virtues, all of the beauty of divinity, and that we aim our lives at remembering that and circumambulate the right things that hold us in that sacred memory, that's a life lived in devotion. We are then nurturing real health. We are then nurturing a connection to our source. So Cancer, not surprisingly, the moon was related to memory. And the act of remembrance is maybe most fundamentally depicted in that of a mother. A mother is always remembering the child is always remembering the mother. Well, that's a metaphor for God. God or source, universe, whatever word you're comfortable with, is always taking care of us and remembering us. But we also have to reach back out, create a circumambulation pattern in our life so that we're always remembering our source. Of course, our source is who we are. It's not something that's just completely apart from us. The source is like a divine being, but it's also a divine being that communes and lives with us and is our very essence. And so, in Cancer, the act of remembrance is most commonly associated with mothers and nurturance and children and family and domestic things. But any way in which we put ourselves into nurturing a connection, to fostering with care something that we're doing or something that we are devoted to, the things that we have to remember, or even the feeling of nostalgia and memory in general, this kind of romantic mood is really the underlying constant for Cancer. And the lesson of the lifetime is often about remembering our original divine source. And how do we do that, as opposed to always trying to foster or remember things that don't really fill us up, in which case we become needy. And so if the need is for connection, to remember and be remembered by our divine original source, and to circumambulate or find a kind of repetition like the moon around something that can stand for source. This is why, for example, in the Krishna Bhakti tradition, we say that there are many different relationships in the world that mirror the kind of relationship that the soul has with God. For example, you can nurture a friendship. And so one of the ways that we talk about bhakti perfecting is in the mood of friendship between the soul and God. We also talk about the dynamic of the parental relationship, where God is either our parent, or, and we feel that way, which is very common in the Christian tradition, for example, or in the Bhakti tradition, we feel like we are God's parent. And so there's a mood in which we feel like the divine is something that we're taking care of, like a mother or a father. There's also the feeling of servant. Let me help you. Let me do something for you. Let me work for you. Let me do things that would be pleasing to you. Like a worker or a servant doesn't sound so good in our moment because of the way workers are generally treated and because of, like, obviously the history of slavery. But we're talking about like someone who thinks of myself as like God's helper, that's another mood in bhakti. So is lover, and so on and so forth. So, but any of those relationships that we have in human life, for example, can become the way in which, if you're a Cancer, you have strong Cancer energy, the way in which you are connecting to source is by circumambulating, nurturing, and caring for something that you put at the center. You have to remember, so that that doesn't become secretly about your own neediness, that it's that this thing that you're putting at the center, that you're nurturing and serving, is ultimately about seeing it as one of the temporary manifestations of God. If God is in all things and you're a parent, then you see your children not as something that you're serving to make yourself feel good, to make yourself feel secure, but something that you're serving because it is a temporary manifestation of God in your life. So that just that little shift is often something that Cancers need to make in order to, this is something I'm serving because it's part of my divine calling. And then the focus shifts from an underlying selfishness that's a part of the thing that I'm serving, because it's really like I'm circumambulating my blanket, as you know what I mean? Like I'm circumambulating my separation anxiety. Then I'm circumambulating something that I'm seeing as a service to God, and whatever mood that might be in, friend, mother, whatever. And this is why Cancers are also sometimes very patriotic or nationalistic, country or family or tribe or culture. You'll just see this need to serve and nurture that connection. But we have to remember why we're doing that, so that it's not ultimately about neediness. My favorite book by C.S. Lewis is The Silver Chair, which is the book that he wrote in the Narnia Chronicles that was imbued with the lunar symbolism. That's why it's called The Silver Chair, silver being the metal of the moon. In that book, the heroine Jill is about to descend down into Narnia, the sublunary sphere, where the air is denser and you'll be more prone to forgetting me, Aslan, the Christ figure, tells Jill. And in order to not forget me, you have to watch for the signs, he says, that will remind you of me and what you're there to actually serve and what you're there to actually be connected to. And then he also says, in order to not forget the signs, repeat them over and over and over to yourself, like a mantra, like a prayer. So this idea is that what we're remembering, what we're trying to remember and have this kind of romantic, sweet connection with, is divinity. Cancers can also be collectors of things, because things will have a way of being imbued with, so I need to care for or capture and hold there's some numinous light that's contained in things that catch my eye. That can be a Cancerian trait as well. At any rate, Jill goes down into Narnia and ends up forgetting the signs. In Krishna consciousness, in the Bhakti tradition, there's two rules that come from one of the famous scriptures that say that basic rules of Bhakti summarized: never forget God and always remember God, or Krishna. So the final one is that Cancer is passive aggressive. You'll sometimes hear this. Well, again, any of these can be true. Can Cancer be needy? Yes, but now you know why. Now you know the deeper the deeper impulse or impetus that's there, and you can honor it and treasure people who are working with those lessons. Same thing with home and family. Cancer is passive aggressive. So the need for connection, the need to remember, the need to nurture, the need to circumambulate, the need for those reminders can be annoying, right? One of the funny things about the book, The Silver Chair, is that there's a figure in that book whose name is Puddleglum, and he's called a marshwiggle. And he's basically kind of a melancholic Eeyore type of figure who's always kind of like, oh, well, it might rain today. Oh, things aren't going so well. And he's kind of like this bummer character. But the interesting thing is, he is the one that constantly is trying to remind Jill about the signs that Aslan gave her. Don't forget them, repeat them to yourself. You're going to forget them. Shouldn't you pay attention to them? And he has a way, she gets really annoyed with it. And so he becomes increasingly sort of, there's some trepidation that he has about approaching her and talking to her about it, because he can tell that she's annoyed. And I notice this with my girls and myself, or my wife too, is that, the parental reminders about what to stay connected to, about how to stay in the right rhythm, or how to stay in the right place. Those little reminders are sort of annoying. Aslan doesn't say, I'm going to go down and walk with you, and don't worry, you won't forget, because I'll be right there, and I'll fill your ears with it all the time, and I'll do it for you. No, this is something that Jill, the heroine, is sent into Narnia to do as a way of individuating spiritually. So apparently, and I mean, as far as I can tell, this is true in my own spiritual path, apparently the universe, or God, wants us to become godlike, in a sense, not like all powerful or something, but there's a sense in which we're all here to get our own little starry halos. And part of that means that we have to cultivate things on our own, apart from source, just like a parent has to also guide a child into spiritual individuation. The universe is doing that for us. God is doing that for us. And the reminders are sometimes really annoying. They're sometimes really annoying because we want to stand on our own, but we need the help. So sometimes that whole dynamic, which is really a metaphysical, religious, spiritual dynamic at its core, the more asleep we are, the more that plays out in ways that can feel really passive aggressive. I'm needy, I'm needy, I'm needy. You're not really meeting my needs. You're not really meeting my needs. You're not really meeting, and it gets more and more sort of demanding, and it can play out in ways that are just totally mundane and really don't have anything to do with the spiritual dimensions that we're talking about. The need for connection while also being a part and individual is difficult in the sign of Cancer. That's why Mars is in its fall in this sign. We can sometimes resent that which we're moving apart from as we individuate. We want to remain close, but we need to stand on our own. These things are difficult. And also, there's this feeling that if I stand alone or apart, that I'm no longer human, that I'm no longer ensouled, because the truth is that reality is relational. Reality is not about objects and mundane, empty, dry, mechanical laws about different objects and chemicals flying around. There's a level to experience and existence that is material and causal and mechanical, and there's laws, but those laws are ultimately the laws that keep energy systems that beings are moving through, And so the other thing that's core to Cancer is what is personal. And sometimes we have to, in order to really deeply value what is personal, we also have to dip our toes into experiences of what is impersonal. And this is why there's also such an interesting dichotomy between the moon sign of Cancer and the opposite sign of Capricorn, where Saturn is the ruler. We could talk about that another time, but at any rate, these can be challenges for Cancer. All of these things that can lead to things like passive aggressiveness. We resent that which we're moving apart from. We want to remain close. We want things to be about people and not objects. We want things to be about ensouled relational experiences and not objectifying experiences. And yet, one of the interesting truths is that it's as though the way that the universe or God draws us closer and opens our hearts and our souls is by giving us little experiences of what it feels like to immerse ourselves in selfishness, which is ultimately an objectification of ourselves and of God and of other people and of nature. It's like, go ahead, try what impersonal objectification looks and feels like. What happens when you dip your toes in it is surging up inside of you is the cry like a child to the mother. No, please bring back the love, bring back the connection. I'm a being and I need and love and want love with other beings, especially, starting within myself and then, spreading out into the world. There's one of my favorite parts in the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is a famous bhakti text, is when there's basically a very enlightened woman who is receiving instructions about the nature of reality and truth, and the lesson that she receives says, unless you can learn to see God in all beings and all beings alive in God, you're not going to be enlightened. It's not some kind of objective that you go and accomplish through personal mastery and control of the mind and all of this kind of stuff. It's something that happens as your heart opens more and more to the humanity of whoever's directly in front of you, I guess, starting off with, right? So at any rate, I hope that this has been helpful. This is one of the ones where I have to be careful. I can just go on and on because I'm a Cancer sun. So, but I hope it's useful for you. Cancer sun, Cancer rising, Cancer moon, especially people who have stelliums in Cancer, people who have cancers in their lives. Hope that this has been helpful. Don't forget my new class, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, begins in November, on November 13th. It's coming up really quickly. You can find out more about it on my website, nightlightastrology.com. If you like this kind of stuff, if you're like, oh, this is my jam, we spend a whole year together studying as we go through. We build our way up from the foundations and roots philosophically and spiritually. We really dig very deeply into houses, signs, planets, aspects, essential dignities, predictive methods from the ancient Hellenistic astrologers. And we also are always adding a kind of modern archetypal psychology to the way that we read for people. And then at the end of the class, you get to see me read for people over and over and over again. And we break down the readings and talk about them. A lot of people go on to read for others after this course. There's an optional certification test at the end. There's a staff of tutors that I have, some of my best students from previous programs who are currently helping me to guide you inside and outside of class. I teach all the classes. They're all recorded, so you can participate live or follow along on your own time. There's breakout study sessions. There's tons of homework and exercises and all sorts of good stuff to help you if you want to go take the next step with your astrological journey. Remember, early bird payment, you can save $500 off if you register right now. You can also use a payment plan. There's also need-based tuition for people who are on a really tight budget, or maybe you're a single parent or you're in school or something like that. So please take advantage of that if that's you. Always like to see as many people having access to this spiritual tradition as possible. So that's what I've got for today. And if you have any questions about the program, feel free to email me, info@nightlightastrology.com. All right, take it easy, everyone. Bye.